Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Magiti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we have seen about something about knowledge, about ignorance, about how ignorance seems to come and cover knowledge, and that's where we are now. And we also saw about the karma chain and how we are caught up in this loop. And if we have to get out of this mess, then we have to break this chain. Now, any chain is as strong as its weakest link. This chain that I mentioned, ignorance, desire, action, birth and rebirth. I'm sorry about that. The weakest link in this chain is the link that connects desire with karma. Because all the other links we have pretty much less control over it. That ignorance will lead to desire, you cannot break it there. A desire will lead to action, you cannot break it there. But here is this karma, the desire and karma. That's the one which is the key point here. Now, all of the different yogas that Swami Vivekananda taught prescribe a different instrument to cut this chain at this weakest link. In Karma Yoga, the instrument that is used is called the detachment. In Bhakti Yoga, the instrument that is used is this intense love and longing for God. In Raja Yoga, the instrument that is used is a very strong inner discipline. And in Jnana Yoga, the instrument that is used is called discernment. In Sanskrit, the word is viveka. So how do we now apply viveka, the instrument to cut this chain, cut this link between desire and action? Now what is discernment, first of all? We go back to that example of mistaking a rope for a snake. So you enter your room, there's insufficient light, there is a coiled rope, you mistake it for a snake. Now the natural human reaction is to just kind of yell and shout and so on. Now if you are a person with some viveka, with some discernment, instead of immediately reacting, you will pause and say, a snake. What's a snake doing in my room here? And there are no snakes in this neighborhood, so this seems pretty unusual. Let me switch on the light, or let me go closer and look at it. And maybe you go a little bit closer and say, it's only a rope, it's not a snake. The problem is solved. Now that is what discernment means. That instead of giving this knee-jerk reaction to things that happen in life, to just pause, to think carefully, reason, and then arrive at the truth. So this practice of discernment is the primary practice in Jnana Yoga. Now, we need not everyone can practice discernment well unless and until we have certain basic characteristics. And one characteristic clearly is we need to have a healthy skepticism. By healthy skepticism, first of all, it means like, what is the snake doing here? This is not the right place for the snake to be. So you need a skepticism. You don't, if you are gullible enough to accept anything and everything that anyone might say, then this is not the path for you. So your first instinct should be, I don't believe it. And I will believe only if it makes sense to me. I will believe only if it resonates with my head and heart. So healthy. Now there can be kind of a cynical skepticism. I'm not saying like, well, everything is fake. No, that's not what I mean. A healthy skepticism means not accepting anything blindly. To be always vigilant. A second requirement is the ability and the patience to examine everything carefully without jumping to conclusions. Because a lot of the examinations that we do, we already have prejudices and biases inbuilt within us. Now that may not be something that we might be able to remove entirely, but at least we should make a conscious effort to see everything in as impartial a way as we humanly can. And a third requirement is fearless questioning, not being afraid to ask any questions. Sri Ramakrishna used to tell his disciples, test me the way money changers test them. So he was not afraid of asking any questions. And that's one greatness about Vedanta that attracted me to it as a student, was that it never said, just believe it just because I say so. He said, ask questions. Don't be afraid of asking questions. So these are the three requirements: healthy skepticism, a careful examination without prejudices and biases, and fearless questioning. Now, in any religious or spiritual discussion, we are essentially dealing with three entities. The first entity is, of course, the world that we encounter. The second is me, who I am, what's my place in this world. And a third entity, usually called by the term God in religious language, is something which is neither me nor this world. So there is this third. Now, the different religious traditions essentially are juggling with these three things: me, the person, the world, and God. How are they related and interrelated among themselves? And so one of the ways we can distinguish one tradition from another is the different ways these relationships are configured in different traditions and different denominations within a larger tradition. So a person with discernment should not be afraid to ask questions about all of these three things. And so that's what we'll try to do in the next few minutes. So what are the kind of questions that come to our mind about the world that we live in? And the very first question, obviously, is the world. Well, what is the world? We all speak about the term world all the time. And what is the world really? And we can ask, again, there is no one, since we use the same word but mean different things by it, we just have to since we all use the same word, world, but mean different things by it, sometimes we just have to ask ourselves, every time we say, oh, what's happened to this world? Why is the world like that? So what is really the extent of our world? And again, some people might always like this. He hasn't come today, our astrophysicist. So if an astrophysicist think, they usually think about the galaxies and like the whole material expanse of the universe. Many of us, most of the time we speak of the world, we are not even thinking of our galaxy. Pretty much just this little planet of ours. And sometimes we speak of the world, we are again usually referring to mostly to human beings. But for many of us, the world that we refer to is a much smaller entity. You see, by and large, most of us at some stage in life kind of gets into what we call just a regular routine. There is a certain some set number of places we visit. There's a fixed number of people that we see on a daily basis. So it's these few places that we kind of go through, and then the people we meet. Occasionally, on vacations, we might make some trips nearby, and then sometimes on the outer fringes of our little world is this some places that might be in the news that you read about. That's about it. So we pretty much, our actual world in a practical sense is a very small bubble in which we really move. So, and as little babies, when we were little babies, of course we are still encountering the world, but by that time we don't have the necessary tools to begin questioning about it. The world to a little baby just is sight, sounds and different smells that come. But as we grow older and we begin to think, questions begin to arise about the world in which we live. One of the things that we see about the world is that it's predominantly very self-referential. By that I mean that only things which are directly related to us or affect us in some way are more a part of my world. The things which don't really concern me or about which I know nothing don't really exist for me. That's a little bit about, we were speaking a little bit early in the morning about the things that I don't even know exist. At least as far as I am concerned, that doesn't exist. For someone else it might exist. For my world, they are not a part of my world if I don't know that they exist. Now the next question that sometimes in Vedanta we get to ask is, well, is the world that we see real? Now most normal people will not ask that question. It's like, well, it's so obvious it's real. Why even question it? But again, if you have discernment, if you have viveka, if you are willing to have the healthy skepticism, then this question makes complete sense. Now, why should I question the reality of the world? Because I see it, I smell it, I taste it, and everything seems to be very real. But again, with discernment, we recognize that all of these true things are true in dream also. In dream also, if I feel thirsty, I drink water and it quenches my thirst. The water the tiramisu that I might eat in my dream will be as tasty as the tiramisu that I eat when in my waking state. So again, who is to say whether if it's for unreal, why would that unreal tiramisu in my dream make me happy? So again, everything that seems to happen in this world, so merely the experiencing the world through our senses is not enough of a reason to believe in its reality. And again, the question that we spoke about a little bit earlier this morning was, it's natural to assume, well, the world continues to exist when I am asleep. And we saw from a science point of view that you are really depending on the testimony of others. But there's one more reason. If it's possible for this world to continue to exist when I'm not aware of it, would you be willing to grant that the dream world in which you were last night, and after you woke up from your sleep, you are no longer aware of your dream world? Now, does the dream world continue to exist even after you are waking up? Now, why would you say that the dream doesn't continue to exist after you wake up? What is the reason? It's not a rhetorical question, I'm expecting an
Because you're awake.
Huh?
Because you're awake. And
But the very fact you're awake means you're no longer aware of the dream. Well, if the dream world doesn't exist because you're no longer aware of it, why does this world continue to exist when I'm no longer aware of it when I'm asleep? So you can again see, a person with discernment would say, well, I'm not being logical here. If I give this as a reason why the dream world doesn't exist after I wake up, I must apply the same logic that this world then doesn't exist, or you could, I mean, there are two ways you can be even more rigorously accurate. Because anything doesn't exist would be a dogmatic statement also. What you can say is either, I don't know if it exists, or at least you could say, it doesn't exist for me. Because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist. Whether it exists for others or not, that's not really your problem. Now, we tend to dismiss dreams, as unreal, because somehow the waking world appears to be more real than the dream. Now, the moment we kind of use this comparative degree that the waking world is more real, we are already accepting levels of reality. And that's exactly what we find in Shankara's commentaries. We call it it's called satta. Let's call it vyavaharika satta, pratibhasika satta, paramarthika satta. These are all levels of reality. And so if it's possible for us to say that the waking world is somehow more real than the dream world, again, to be very logical, a person with discernment would say, then who am I to then say that this is like the best reality? If it is possible for something to be less real than this, it's possible for something to be more real than this. And we could say therefore that whatever that being or that reality is we call by the term God is someone or something which is more real than this waking world. And it's not something simply a logical conclusion, but we also see that this has been borne out by actual experience. When Vivekananda as a young man, as a Narendranath, went to Ramakrishna and asked him, have you seen God? And Ramakrishna's reply was, yes, I see him more intensely than I am seeing you. But that's exactly what he meant. That yes, I'm seeing you now, that's real. But when I see God, that's somehow more real than this. So that's another insight that comes to us in applying discernment to world. What about questions related to me who is experiencing this world? Because oftentimes, as we saw earlier today also, that no amount of finding out answers about the world will solve the problem fully. Every discovery that science makes, we find that opens the door to more things that science doesn't know. Every time we come to say, oh, this is a new thing science has found, one new door that's opened, beyond that you find two more doors that are not yet opened. Every time you find one particle which we didn't know the existence of, the possibility, at least the theoretical possibility of 5 other particles comes into view. And then you have the next generation of scientists trying to find out whether that which was theoretically possible can also be then found out in laboratory. So, looking and exploring and dissecting the external world somehow seems to be, at least so far, an endless job. It's interesting, it's stimulating, it's fascinating, it's great, but still seems to be a bottomless pit. And so, a person with discernment would say, why not I first explore this one being who is certifying the existence of the world, who is experiencing the world, and that's me. So then who am I? Who is this me? And we have already seen this earlier, that my present me is a combination of the visible body, the invisible mind, and then something beyond that, the Atman. We also saw that just as in the rope snake analogy, you cannot see both at the same time. In fact, there is a Sanskrit verse, and there is also in Tamil, in Tirukkural. Any Tamilians here? Yeah, so in Tirukkural there is actually one verse, I don't know the original in Tamil, but it goes, which goes like this. If you see, if there's a carving of an elephant, a wooden elephant, if you see the wood, you don't see the elephant. If you see the elephant, then you don't see the wood. You cannot see both at the same time. Exactly the same way, even in that rope and snake analogy, you cannot see rope and snake at the same time. Actually, you see, think about it this way. When you mistake a rope for a snake, and you say, "Oh, this is a snake," that statement is not totally false. That statement is partially correct. Because when you say this is a snake, and you can break that statement into two parts, that this is some object and that object is a snake. Now the first part is absolutely true. Well, this is some object. The second part is a mistake. So the isness, this is what gives that presence of an object. That presence is the presence of the rope. So even when I'm seeing the snake, I'm still seeing the rope, but not as rope. So I cannot therefore see both rope and snake at the same time. If I see the rope, I don't see the snake. When I see the snake, I don't see the rope. Exactly in the same way, me, if I see myself as a human being, I cannot see myself as a divine being at the same time. If I see myself as a divine being, I cannot see myself as a human being. Which is why we said in the morning, if I want to see myself as a divine being, I have to stop seeing myself as a human being. I can't have it both ways. But somehow, because of Maya, that while both cannot simultaneously exist, and Maya seems to make what is impossible seemingly possible, they seem to coexist. Actually, they cannot. Light and darkness cannot coexist, but they seem to coexist. The material and the non-material seem to coexist, and the material seems to cover the non-material. That's why we speak about the koshas and the coverings and so on. Now, which of these two, the spiritual me or the material me, which of this me is the real me? And one equation that Vedanta uses, again, you could say it's an assumption, but it's an assumption on which our entire experience is based. And that is, what is real? And in Vedanta, they make a simple equation: real equals eternal, satya equals nitya. In other words, there is no such thing as a temporary reality. I mean, think about it this way. Why is it that we dismiss dreams as unreal? Well, because they are temporary. They didn't exist before I went to sleep. They don't exist after I wake up. They seem to exist only during that interim period. Compared to that, this world seems to exist, seems to have a greater persistence than the dreams. That's one reason why we feel the waking world is more real than the dream world, because the dream world is temporary. When a magician produces something in the hand out of nowhere and it disappears in no time, you say, well, that's not real. Because again, it doesn't last. But if something can never ever go away, then we say, well, then it can't be unreal. And that's how in Vedanta, real always means eternal. Now, if you want to be rigorous in applying that logic, it's very easy to understand, therefore, why the body and mind cannot be real. Because The body disappears when I sleep, when I am asleep. The mind disappears in deep sleep. If they were real, they would never disappear. What never disappears, this is most important, what never disappears is consciousness. Consciousness is present right now, because consciousness, without consciousness, no knowledge is possible. I have knowledge of this, what is happening around me in the waking world, because of the presence of consciousness. Consciousness is present in the dream state. If there was no consciousness, I wouldn't see the dream. So consciousness is present there. Consciousness is present in deep sleep state. Well, how do I know? Because I am able to remember the experience in deep sleep when I wake up in the morning. So when you have deep sleep, in the next morning you say, I slept so well, I didn't know anything. So what you are essentially saying is, you experience some kind of happiness in that. And you also experienced a kind of nothingness, like, I didn't know anything. Now, there has to be consciousness present in order to experience that joy in deep sleep, experience that nothingness in deep sleep. So the only entity that never, ever, ever, ever disappears, whether it's waking, dream and deep sleep, is just consciousness. And what Vedanta says is, you are that consciousness. The more we are able to simply remember, I am just this consciousness, I am just this light. The bulb may sometimes get fused, the fan may stop working, but the power always is there. So the body and the mind are just these fixtures, but consciousness is always there. Now I have somehow begun to see myself as the body and mind, which is why I'm affected by that. But if I know I'm really that consciousness, then I'm completely free from all this. So that is what discernment will do. And looking at deeply within me, and I say, what is? See, it's like this. If you line up all the photographs of yours, right, from whatever photographs from your personal family album you have, from different years, you see you have changed quite a lot. We are little babies, we only weighed a few pounds, and we weigh much more now. So all physically, mentally, emotionally, at different stages of life, a lot has changed and is continuing to change. And yet, we all feel I'm still the same person. So there is something that has remained unchanged within me. And what has remained unchanged is just this consciousness. Everything else, the body has changed, the mind has changed, and there is this illusion somehow. This I is a sense of illusion. As they say, a person with an axe said, oh, this is the axe that I've had in my generations for 14 generations. Only the handle has changed for about 15 times, and then that, what do you call that, front portion? The blade, yeah, whatever it is, that's been changed a few times, but it's the same axe that we have used. So it's also a little bit like if you're a fan of some team, what is the local team here called? Steelers. So I'm sorry, my ignorance, because all that I'm aware of is Red Sox. So Steelers now. See, if you are a fan of Steelers, you can ask yourself, well, who are the Steelers? Because the players have changed over the years, the coaches have changed, the trainers have changed, oftentimes the owners have changed. And some of you have this illusion that it's the same team. That's exactly what's happened with them. That the body is continually changing, the mind is continually changing, but there is just this illusion, and that illusion is this ego. So ego really doesn't have any firm grounding. It's just this illusory I. Well, the real I is just this consciousness, which is standing and watching what's going on. That's all. So this is what a person with discernment will observe. So we need to distinguish between the Atman and the ego. they apparently might seem to be same. The Atman is the self and ego is self, that's me. But actually nothing could be more different. As I said in the beginning, the ego cuts me off from other people. Because the sense of I always comes with the awareness of not I, not me, not me, not me, this is me. It just cuts me off. On the other hand, the Atman is this undivided consciousness. If I'm identified with the Atman, the consciousness, then I'm not cutting myself off from anyone, because consciousness is undivided, unbounded. There is only one. There are not many consciousnesses. There is consciousness doesn't even have a plural. And so we have to then distinguish between consciousness and the ego. And let's look at this third entity. What would a person with discernment, viveka, ask about God? Beginning with the very obvious question, well, who is God? One way of answering that question, because again, God is again a kind of a very loaded term. 10 people might use the same word and may mean 10 different things. And that's all the arguments and fights the world over are because people use same words but mean different things by it, and then it's a mess. So how would one way of answering that question would be, in Vedanta, in Brahma Sutras, they say, well, the word that is used for God often in Vedanta is Brahman. And so one way of defining would be, well, God is one from whom the entire world or this creation emerges, into whom this whole world, within whom this whole world rests, and unto whom ultimately the whole world returns. Srishti, Sthiti and Pralaya. It occurs in that one being, and that being is God. Now, this is a fine definition, except that, well, it doesn't really explain how this world comes from God. It doesn't really explain what does resting in God really mean. And it doesn't also really explain, well, what does returning to God really means. And more importantly, this definition doesn't say anything about, how would you define God without bringing the world into the equation? What is God without reference to the world? What would a creator God mean without a creation? Would a creator God exist without creation? A creator God is definitely dependent on the creation. It's like a king without a palace. Well, then the king is not a king if there is no palace involved, or no kingdom to rule over. Now, the problem with this is that there is no universally acceptable definition about God. And not just about God, pretty much there is no universal acceptable definition about anything in the world. And so, all that we find is that people have asked these questions about the world, about God, and different answers have emerged in different points in life. And answers really means the using concepts and framework to explain our experience about the world and existence that we have. What does really answers mean? We are really using some conceptual framework. And these different frameworks that have come across from different times and different places have eventually taken the form of different religious traditions. What is often not recognized is that frameworks can be different and can be many. But what are those concepts pointing to? Is what they are pointing to different? That's the main question. All the disagreements and fights and quarrels that people have about God is not really about God, but their ideas about God. And the idea of God is different from God. It's like the picture of a mango is different from mango. The picture of a mango can remind you of a mango, but you can't eat the picture. You need a real mango. So, but all the fights and quarrels that people have, they say these interreligious fights and disagreements are really about ideas and concepts. And people who seek truth use these concepts to look at the reality, and they don't have any quarrel. As in Buddhist tradition, oftentimes I like the way they put it, that the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. And you need if you're pointing at some kind of a remote star in the sky, well, you need some kind of a pointer and say, well, that's the star. But that's only to help you look at the real star. If someone starts looking at your pointer, then the point is lost. Well, so just like the question we asked about the world, does the world exist? We can ask the similar question about God. And well, people have asked this question about God. Does God exist? And again, that's a very loaded question. People who see themselves as believers say God exists. And then there are others who are non-believers say God doesn't exist. And both are equally fanatical in many ways. People who say God exists are not able to prove objectively that God exists. But neither are people who say God doesn't exist able to prove that God doesn't exist. In fact, I have had some discussions with those who define themselves as humanists, or sometimes are atheists or agnostics at Harvard and MIT. And I sometimes say, why is the onus only on religious people to prove that God exists? I said, well, you prove that God doesn't exist. But they don't have any proof either. So their statement that God doesn't exist is as much a matter of faith. And also when someone says, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe God exists, I often ask them, well, which God you don't believe in? Because it's like this. You can only deny that which you know. You cannot deny the God that you don't even know exists. Right? I mean, you can only deny whatever you are aware of. You cannot deny what you are not aware of. So when people say that God doesn't exist, they are being exposed to certain ideas or notions about God in their life which doesn't make sense. And they are denying that, and they have a right to do so, and that's perfect. I respect that. But to say that God doesn't exist, meaning that even the God that I am not aware of doesn't exist, that doesn't seem scientific either. So we can only deny something that we are exposed to. So, in fact, as I sometimes say that when I ask this question, which kind of God you don't believe in, or what kind of God you think doesn't exist, and then they often describe the kind of God that they feel doesn't make sense. And after that, well, it doesn't make sense to me either. And I said, well, but I don't see myself as an atheist, although the God that you deny, I deny too. And that it's good, it kind of at least opens the door to a conversation. What's important to recognize is that it's possible, the reason the answers are different about God is that the moment we try to put our experience into words, the description of an experience will not come anywhere close to the experience itself. That's always. It's not just about God, it's about anything. It's like even if you have a good cup of coffee and then you give 10 people the same coffee and then say, okay, describe your experience. They're not going to describe it in exactly same words. What they describe will depend on the language that they are familiar with, and they want to the symbols or the imagery or the examples or the metaphors that the kind of setting that they have been brought up, the kind of proficiency they have in their explanation, all of this will make a difference when they try to describe even a cup of coffee. The same thing with regard to God as well. So the experience of God need not be different, but the expression of that experience will be different. And that is why the description that have come down to us from different cultural backgrounds at different points in history, they are different and they are bound to be different. And now, wisdom consists, discernment consists in going beyond the description and looking at that reality itself. So does God exist? What Vedantic answer to that question is that Vedanta equates God with existence. In fact, when you say Sat Chit Ananda, Sat means existence. So God is existence. And therefore it's very difficult to, not difficult, it's impossible to say that in Vedanta that God doesn't exist, because that's like saying existence doesn't exist. That's why in the Taittiriya Upanishad it is said that if someone says God doesn't exist, that is tantamount to saying I don't exist. And we saw earlier that you cannot deny your own existence. And so because Vedanta equates God with existence itself, the question of God's existence seems kind of mute. Vedanta goes a step further. It not only says that God is existence itself, but it says God alone exists. In other words, if anything seems to exist, it is nothing but God. That is the Vedantic approach. But even when Vedanta says God is existence, what it really means is a little different. And Shankaracharya in his commentary in the Upanishad, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, when it is said Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, the Brahman is being, Satyam, consciousness, Jnanam, and Anantam, infinity. So in the commentary, Shankara says, when we say God is being, what we really mean is God is not non-being. When we say God is consciousness, what we really mean is that God is not material. God is not unconsciousness, not non-consciousness. When we say God is infinity, what we mean is God is not finite. In other words, we can only say what God is not. If we eliminate everything that God is not, whatever remains is God. So even to say God is Satchidananda is not a perfect description. Even to say God is Satchidananda is to actually limit God. So when you say God is Sat, what you really mean is God is not Asat. When you say God is Chit, what you really mean is God is not Achit. That's how essentially it means. So then the question is, God is someone whom I cannot describe, who we have not experienced. How can we get any help from a God whom nobody has seen and whose you cannot even describe? So how can we get such a help? And the answer is simple. The answer is, whenever I have the need, I am in need, God somehow becomes the fulfiller of that need. If I become, see, the relationship, Swami Vivekananda once defined religion as the eternal relationship between the eternal soul and eternal God. And the relationship between me and God is a very dynamic relationship. If I change, then God changes for me. If I see myself as a child, to me God becomes father or mother. If I feel I'm lost, then God becomes my guide. If I need company, God becomes my friend. If I'm in trouble, God comes in the form of a rescuer. In fact, for many of us, God is some kind of a 911, a divine 911 call. And just as we don't call 911 when everything is going fine, most of us don't need God when everything is going fine. It's only when there is a problem we suddenly realize, oh, there is God, we need to do something about it. So therefore God takes many forms. So when I see myself as a jiva, as an individualized self, as a jivatma, then God becomes the Paramatma. If I see myself as a bhakta, then God becomes the Bhagavan. If I see myself as a part of God's kingdom, then God becomes the ruler of that kingdom. In fact, the word Ishvara, Parameshwara, Ishvara really means, root in Sanskrit means to rule. So Ishvara means a ruler. Parameshwara means a supreme ruler. So again, if I see myself as a subject in God's kingdom, then God becomes my Ishvara, a Parameshwara. Now, and if I stop becoming anything, I don't want to become a child, I don't want to become this, I don't want to become that, God also stops becoming anything. At that point, the relationship becomes one of unity. So if I change, God changes for me. If I stop changing, God also stops changing. So that is how Vedanta understands. So Vedanta, sometimes people seem to think, oh, Advaita means there is no separate God, I am all in all. It's not like that. Advaita has a place for God. But God understood in this sense that it's a very dynamic relationship between me and this transcendent being. As long as I am tied to this one little thing, I will always need help. And that help will come from God. And God takes the form that I am in need of at that moment. When I no longer need, God also no longer needs to change. And then that is the point that duality will end. So how do I then make sense of all of these different ideas about God we have seen? The first thing we have to recognize is that no description of God is perfect. Even the Vedantic description of God is not perfect. But an imperfect description is better than no description. There is, in Bengali, there is a saying, Nai mamar che kana mama bhalo, which means that, if rather than having no uncle at all, it's better to have even an uncle who is blind. So, if the option is no description of God, nothing, then say, well, give me at least an imperfect description. That's essentially where we are. So no description is perfect. Also, all explanations about the world, all explanations about God are very human explanations. As human beings, we cannot but mostly see things from a human perspective. Which is why, of course, it just feels good. It just kind of pampers our own ego that human beings are like the most evolved of all creatures. That God made the entire creation for us. It just feels good. But then because it's the scriptures that we have thought about. It's a very human way. We don't know what cats and dogs think about us and what they think about God. As we saw yesterday, they might think that they are more evolved than us, which may be true for all we know. Also, Swami Vivekananda said in the Dhyana Yoga lectures that if a cat were to think of God, a cat's God, well, only a cat would know what kind of God a cat is thinking of, but even then, we might speculate, since our God is so human in many ways, a cat's God would be like some big giant cat who is so loving and so on. So again, a cat's needs would get reflected in the kind of God a cat would visualize. Just as our human needs are reflected in the kind of God we as human beings are able to visualize. At every stage, the reason we have different ideas about God is because our needs are different. And as we evolve, our ideas of God evolve too. In fact, I would recommend those of you who are interested in reading on this subject, there is this book called The Evolution of God. It's written by one professor here in UPenn. I forget his name now. But it's a very good book. It's called The Evolution of God. The title could be a little misleading. It's not really that God is evolving. What he's really seeing is the evolution of the concept of God. How the ideas of God evolve as we evolve. So sometimes they say, tell me who your friends are and I will know who you are. But also, in spiritual life, tell me what you think of God or how you think of God. It's a pretty good reflection about who I am. Because the kind of God that makes sense to me is a good indicator of who I am at that point in our evolution. And we see that the reason our ideas of God change is because we are also changing in the process. And that's why Vivekananda and Ramakrishna in their teachings, we see that one of the ideas that often comes is how the progression from a dualistic notion through a qualified non-dualism to non-dualism. And the idea often is that when in the initial stages, God might seem to be a very distant figure. And a lot of it might begin just with fear. But as love enters into our heart, then a kind of a bridge is built between God and us. Then God doesn't appear to be as distant as he or she appeared in the beginning. And then as that love begins to grow, the fear goes away. Because love and fear really can't go together. And so if we truly love God at some stage, that fear will go away. And the closer and closer we come, as they say, love leads to unity. Ultimately, we'll come so close to God that that relationship can only best described as just a unity. And that's how our spiritual journey can begin with dualistic ideas and ultimately reach that state of non-dualism when passing through these intermediate stages. So then, we have seen how discernment can be applied to the world, to my own self, and to God. So what are then the options before me? The options are simple. One option, as I said in the beginning, is something that many people might find comforting, is that, well, all this kind of sounds interesting, but I have so many things to do in life that I don't think I have enough time and energy or interest in pursuing this way of thinking. So, good, thanks, but no thanks. It's like, I'm just going to continue my life. You see, it's like this. It's also the fear of the unknown. We may not be completely satisfied with life as it is now, but it is at least something that we know. We kind of have made, however fragile, some peace with it. It's like, yes, it's not perfect, but at least I know what it is. Now then, to suddenly start thinking differently, it's like upsetting the balance that exists. And people are afraid of that. People are afraid of just creating, because then more uncertainty gets created. We know the difficulties that exist in even changing simple habits, like changing the time you have your breakfast, or changing the time you want to wake up, or how long you want to sleep, or well, whatever habits you are willing to read or stop reading or so on. But difficult as these things are, what is even more difficult is to change the way we think. And more specifically, how we think about ourselves, how we think about, kind of reconfigure the world and our relationships in it, and our understanding of our own self. And that's the tough part. Even when at some level intellectually all of this seems to make sense, to actually put it into practice seems like you are going to disturb the kind of equilibrium that's already seemed to have come in the life. And it's like, oh, no. Not everyone can do it. That's why I said in the beginning, you need a little bit of a courage, a kind of a daredevil kind of an attitude to do it. You have to do it. Someone who wants to play too safe, it's like, oh my God, I don't want to do this, it's risky. Probably they might have less problems, at least in the short term. But such people won't really make too many breakthroughs if you are too cautious, too playing safe. So you need in spiritual life at some point, and especially in Dhyana Yoga, a kind of say, well, this makes sense, and if it makes sense, I'm going to practice it. So the easy option is not do anything. The difficult option is, if something makes sense, and if I don't live up to it, then I'm not being true to myself. I mean, think about it this way. Even those of us who like to see ourselves as devotees, like to see ourselves as believers, like to see that God exists, ask yourself, how many times in the course of a day do we really remember that God exists? And how it's easy to think of God when we need God's help. But do we think of God when everything is going fine? We really don't need God. Do we think of God then? Because if God is always present, actually, if God is always present, life may already change for us. If you are aware that God is always present, in fact, God can be a pretty nuisance at times, I think. I mean, think about it this way. A lot of our life will have to necessarily change. If we know that always God is aware of every little thought in my mind, God is aware of every little thing I do, and if I'm aware that God is aware, life will change. We are blissfully unaware of it. That's why we kind of... They say that Ramakrishna said that I can see through a person as the glass case. I'm sure a lot of people who went to him didn't remember that always. Because it would be like, wow, just to be in his presence, he can just see what's going on inside. Many people would have hesitated to be in his presence if they had remembered it all the time. A lot of time we ourselves don't know what's going on within us. And so, being always in God's presence is tough. And so we need to start getting used to it. And in fact, that's why, however much people might say, oh, I would like to remain immersed in God 24 hours, none of us really can do it, none of us really even want to do it. And even if we would want to do it, we don't have the capacity to do it. So, at the very least, those of us who have a regular spiritual practice, so when we practice the morning and evening, to whatever little time we are able to devote to that, it's a kind of getting used to being in the presence of God. And one of the reasons people feel that my mind gets distracted is because I'm not able to dwell in that thought of God. And so we need to just figure out, even if I can say just for 5 minutes, if I can sit and not think of anything other than my spiritual ideal, then I can at least say I'm able to live in the presence of the Spirit, presence of God for 5 minutes. And that's wonderful. If I can do it today for 5 minutes, maybe after 6 months, I might be able to do it for 6 minutes or 10 minutes. That's how we need to kind of gradually increase our capacity to dwell in God's presence. And that's the difficult option, is I need to take these teachings. If they make sense to me, again, no one is forcing me to do it. But if all of this makes sense, if it resonates with my head and heart, then I must do something about it. And doing something about it would mean applying this discernment, applying this viveka to break this chain at this point of desire and action. That's one simple thing for us. How do you apply discernment to desire? Well, you simply ask the question, who is the one who is desiring? Because the Atman doesn't desire anything. The Atman is complete and full. The body and mind are unconscious. They don't need to desire anything either. It's this kind of a very unholy collaboration between the Atman and the body and mind. They seem to have come together that seems to desire things. Now discernment would say, I am the Atman. I have nothing to do with this. So now for many of us that's very difficult to do. We understand the theory behind it. And so the preliminary step would be, before focusing on the desirer, I focus on the desire itself. But sometimes in spiritual literature, desires get a very bad rap. Desire is bad. I don't think so. I think there's nothing intrinsically bad in desire itself. We just have to see that there are good desires and then there are bad desires. And how would you distinguish between a good desire and a bad desire? The answer is pretty simple. That any desire, fulfillment of which will make me stronger, either physically, mentally, morally, emotionally, good desire, fulfill it. No need to give up that desire. But if there is any desire, the fulfillment of which will make me weaker in some way, either physically, mentally, morally, emotionally, I should then keep away from it. So it's simple. Look upon a desire, see if it makes you strong, say yes to it. So desire themselves, don't think that desire themselves are bad. So desire, when it comes in the heart, rather than just kind of pounce on it or just kind of give that knee-jerk reaction to it, either yes or no, a discernment would say, take your time, look at it carefully, see what it does. If it's going to make you strong in some form, say yes. If it's going to say weak in some form, say no. So that's one way of dealing with this. If you can do that, over time, we will acquire then the capacity to focus on the desirer and then know that I am the Atman. I don't need to desire anything. And automatically that link that connects desire with action can be broken by applying discernment to the desirer, but first then doing it to desire itself. Same thing with regard to action, to work. So what would a discernment would mean? Well, again, action, you focus on the one who is doing action. Now, who does action? Again, Atman consciously doesn't do anything. The body, mind are just material. They don't need to do anything. Again, the combination of the Atman with the body, mind, consciousness of body, mind, that is making all action possible. Again, you ask yourself, as I give you that example of me reading the book, it's really material entities interacting with one another. So I can apply discernment there and say, I'm not really doing anything. Everything is being done by the body and mind. Again, in the beginning, if I find that difficult to do, I can focus first on the action itself. And just as we distinguished good desires from bad desires, we can distinguish good actions from bad actions. And again, the criteria is simple. Any action that will make me strong in some way, Swami Vivekananda said, strength is life, weakness is death. So any action that will make me strong at any of these levels, physical, mental, moral, emotional, good action, do it. Anything that will make me weak, don't do it. In this way, we again increase the capacity, and then we are able to distinguish the worker from the work that is done, and the desirer from the desire that comes. That's how we apply a discernment and then break that chain. When that chain is broken, the problem is solved. So we'll stop here now, and then what we will do tomorrow, in the last class that we meet, we will actually see the practice. What are the kind of practices that can evolve out of this? What we have seen up yesterday evening and the 2 times we met this morning was to have kind of a theoretical framework of Jnana Yoga. And what we'll try to do tomorrow is to evolve some actual practices to put this into somehow make it a part of our spiritual life. So I welcome your thoughts, questions on whatever we saw just now.
Okay, I have a question about some differences and similarities between Advaita and Buddhism, because the two are very similar in many ways. And when you gave the analysis of the axe, they said this is the same axe that's been passed down, but then when you analyze it, it's actually completely different over time. Or the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're not the same now that they were a few years ago. And in many ways, I think Advaita and Buddhism would agree on that. My sense in Buddhism is that when it comes to consciousness, the Buddhists also say that because the content of consciousness is different from moment to moment, that consciousness right now is different from the consciousness of a few minutes ago or in the future. But my sense in Advaita is that consciousness is one. So what would be an Advaita response to that? The Buddhist claim that even consciousness is not ultimately real. I think the word consciousness, when it gets used in Buddhism, it's always consciousness of something. Consciousness with an object. The idea of an objectless consciousness itself, I don't think it's not there, but I don't think Buddha explicitly spoke about it. And the reason is the Buddhist philosophy was not created by the Buddha. The philosophy is a creation that occurred after him. And Buddha was the most pragmatic, most practical teacher of any time, past, present and future. And his point was, what's the problem? The problem is he reduced the problem to saying this desire, with tanha. And his was like, once you get rid of this, who I am will automatically, I am who I am. There's nothing to be done about it. But if I can remove this thing which is the cause of suffering, I will be who I am. So he didn't speak about it. So that's essentially it. And while in Vedantic text, they speak about it, and he didn't speak about it. Right? Something. In fact, and to footnote to that is Vivekananda referred to the Buddha as one of the greatest teachers of Vedanta ever born. So Buddha was not a Buddhist.
So just wondering around discernment and how to develop and trust proper discernment, because my different layers of mind or whatever can come into play and play tricks and lead to desires and paths of action or work that I can rationalize something that I, on a deeper level, know to cause suffering or perpetuate some misery or unhappiness. But I'll still go to those things because like one level of mind can override another or whatever it was, or discernment's not developed well enough to stop touching the hot stove or experimenting or dabbling in things that don't meet that test of good action or good desire versus bad action, bad desire. How to work.
Or use your best judgment, and doesn't matter that you won't always get it right. You will make mistake. You will stumble, but even when you make mistakes, learn from your mistakes. I mean, no one gets it right all the time. There's not a single person in the world who got it right every time. But for fear that I might not get it right, if I don't do it, I will never achieve anything. So you already have some discernment now. It may not be perfect, but apply your imperfect discernment as best you can, and from the outcome you will know whether it was right or wrong. Sooner or later you will know. If you are alert, just by the effect it produces, you will know whether you are going in the right direction or wrong direction. And then if you find you're going in the wrong direction, correct your course. Learn from your mistake. This is the way gradually your discernment, the capacity to discern, will improve in quality. And we all have to do that. I mean, this is how life is. We just have to muddle our way through it somehow. And learning from the mistakes that we make. That's basically it. Someone who says, I'm just going to get everything perfect and only then make a step, will not be able to achieve anything. So just jump.
Maharaj, you always say that the consciousness is eternal. So just I want to share one feeling which I still question myself. I have an actually epileptic attack when I was in 3rd grade, and I ended up in a hospital, and that part of my life I never even realized that I had it, and that part of few hours of my life, though I was definitely I was unconscious, and I still believe that I cannot recollect anything from that part of my life. So how was consciousness still alive even I was unconscious? So still I question myself, so how is it?
You know that you didn't know anything of that life. You need consciousness even to know that you didn't know.
Okay.
See, even ignorance, before we get knowledge, we must have knowledge of our ignorance before we can remove that ignorance. So even to know that I am ignorant, I must have knowledge, right? It's a little bit like that. So I mean, it's like in deep sleep. Deep sleep, we don't know anything either, but I am aware of the fact that I don't know. So my consciousness is present even in deep sleep, because that is why next morning I can wake up and say, oh, I slept so well, I didn't know anything. So similarly, the same thing can appear when we are unconscious, or when we go through surgery, or when you have an epileptic fit. It's like you wake up and say, oh my God, I didn't know anything. But that not knowing, experience of not knowing anything wouldn't have been possible without consciousness. So even then consciousness was present.
So rather than use words like unconscious for experiences like that, would it be more correct to say that we were conscious of nothing at that point?
That would be more accurate, actually. Yeah.
So I appreciate your encouragement to become fearless in facing certain things. And, when I think about myself in fearlessness, I worry that what I perceive as being fearless may actually become ego, and a failure to actually have the humility required to listen and be cautious when necessary. So do you have any advice for trying to discern, I guess, between fearlessness and unhealthy ego and selfishness.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, we have to be always alert that Ramakrishna once said that ego is such a thing that every time you feel like now there's no ego, somehow it just kind of sprouts up somewhere. So yeah, in spiritual life we have to be always vigilant to see that ego doesn't. Now, one thing I would want to say about this, to make a little bit of a subtle distinction between ego and egoism. Now, ego, simply the sense of I don't think is problematic, too much of a problem. Just I. Okay, that's fine. Egoism would be attaching that I to this, or I am this, or I am that. That becomes problematic. And so I think simple ego is probably inevitable as long as we are in the body and mind. Now, if I can attach that sense of I to a spirit, I mean, you could say it's a form of egoism. I'm a child of God. I'm a devotee. There is egoism involved there. Even to say I'm the Atman, sure, there is an ego attaching itself to the idea of the spirit. But this is what Ramakrishna has called it, the ripe I, the ripe ego, as opposed to the unripe ego. So don't be too much afraid of the ego. Ego is there. Just make sure that it is attached to the right things. Anything, I think, any ego, so long as it is attached to somehow to our spiritual ideal, to our spiritual life, wouldn't do us harm. Again, I mean, you still have to be careful. It's still ego. It can still deceive you. You have to be still vigilant. But I think we are on a safer ground if we attach that ego to something more stable, something than this kind of shifting sands of daily life.
So, Guruji, you mentioned something about being
fearless and accepting a certain sort of reality that may not be perfect all the time, and and it's okay to muddle through and make mistakes and learn. One of the things, actually, your comment about having the experience that you did with your body allowed me to sort of understand that not all experiences, even though at that particular point in time may feel unfortunate or terrible, but through discernment, and what you rightly said, that very often we actually see that there's a lot that you learn through that unfortunate experience. And it's only upon reflection, several times, that you sort of feel, if I had not had that experience, I would not have learned that valuable lesson. So in one sense, the blissfulness, the ananda that you're talking about, is to be able to sort of be in the presence of God and be smiling, even though, I mean, and when you see our images and our deities, one of the things that strikes most people who are not Hindus, they say the Hindu gods are always smiling. They're just always blissful. And so one of the things that we actually end up being is the knowledge that even our worst experiences allow us to understand that there is something better at the end of it. And that brings us tremendous joy. And I feel that the ignorance that we need to dispel is that sorrow that we immediately feel when we experience something, unhappy or sorrowful. But when go beyond that and some time elapses, you start realizing that if I hadn't had that experience, probably whatever I'm experiencing now is not going to be of that depth. So I really feel that sort of having this regular practice of meditation and walking with God allows us to sort of welcome that nuisance that you think is actually constantly molding us and allowing us to understand what joy is, what true joy is.
Sure, that's true. Yeah, that's why when we look at our life, we find that everything that happened in our life, good and bad, pleasant and unpleasant, was somehow necessary for me to be where I am now. So what I am now at this moment is the resultant of everything that has happened in my life. Even if one little thing from my past were to be changed, this would be changed. Because sometimes what most of us want, and it's kind of a very childish in some ways, all the bad things should not have happened. Only good things should have happened. What we don't recognize is that if only good things would have happened, if I can kind of pluck out some of those other things, I wouldn't be where I am now. And probably I might be in a worse place. So just because those things are removed, I might be better, is not an automatic conclusion. So where I am now, we just can't bless everything that happened in the past. And my point is, if we are going to bless everything that happened in the past, after a while, why not bless everything as they're happening right now? You see, it's also a lot of things in life we can see. Sometimes even when you're passing through a difficult phase, when we're actually passing through it, it's no fun. It's very difficult. But what seems like a very terrible thing that's happening to me, sometimes after 6 months you look back at that and you can just kind of laugh at it and say, oh, 6 months ago, this happened and I was so terrible, and you can just kind of laugh it off. Now my point is, if you're going to laugh it off after 6 months, why not do it then? That's very happy. You're going to do that anyway afterward. So, and now this is possible. The reason we find it difficult to do it, it's sometimes easy for us to be objective about something happening in someone else's life. It's easy to tell someone else, no, just take it easy, it doesn't matter. It's, we just kind of give very sage advice when something is happening to other people. But if same thing is happening to ourselves, then we can't be so objective about it. Now, a little bit of the ego that we spoke about earlier is so much tied to this body-mind, this personality, that it's very difficult to objectify ourselves. And a little bit of that loosening of the ego is necessary, essential. If I kind of, at least figuratively, get outside myself and look at myself, well, like I'm one of the several billion people on this earth. Because I'm kind of within this, and everyone thinks I am different, I am special. But no one is special. We are just, we are just one among the billions. The world will go on perfectly fine without us, but better without us. But if we can kind of get a little bit outside ourselves and look at our own life objectively, as if I'm looking at someone else, it's actually a very spiritual practice. You will find that it so much becomes then easier to deal with the inevitable ups and downs in life. The reason we find it difficult is we are kind of so firmly entrenched within this body and mind. Just kind of like a little go outside it. I remember a year and a half ago, or was it last year? Yeah, a little while, I think probably a year and a half ago. I visited, we have a monastery in Mayavati in the Himalayas. Monastery started by Swami Vivekananda. And they have a nice meditation hall there in the guest house. And so we sat there with there were a few guests had come, and we sat. And they have a nice little, there's just Om there, and there's an Advaita Ashrama, so they don't have any other images or anything, just Om. And everyone was sitting and meditating and looking at that Om. And I suggested this, and we all practiced it, and everyone found it very helpful, was this. Normally when we kind of sit, and we just kind of look at the altar, and there is someone at the altar. The altar becomes our object, and we are sitting and we are watching it. And I said, and there was just an Om there, I said, let's now sit here. Now what I want in your imagination, or whichever way you can do it, get out of yourself and go and stand next to that Om and look at yourself meditating. So it's not easy. Like you're kind of getting out of yourself and seeing yourself among the 10 other people sitting there and meditating. And many of them tried it, and then later on we all shared our experiences. But that's something wonderful. You see, oftentimes when and this is one of my favorite incident in this is what I heard from one of our very senior Swamis, was in the 50s when he was on his way to Kedarnath in the Himalayas. And he said that, and some of you may have been there, it's a temple of Shiva there, and a lot of pilgrims go. There's the last trek you have to do on foot, and many people keep on walking. And so he said that among the pilgrims who are walking to the temple of Shiva, there was this one very elderly woman holding her hand. With one hand she had a stick, and the other one on the shoulders of one young boy who seemed to be her grandson. And they were walking, and she was slowly going. And then at some point, like all pilgrims do, they stopped for a while to catch their breath. It's kind of a steep climb. And so the Swami was there, and when he went nearby, he noticed that woman was actually blind in both the eyes. And she was very elderly, very frail, blind, and making this very difficult pilgrimage to go to that Shiva temple. And so he asked, they are speaking in Hindi, and he asked her, why are you taking this trouble? I mean, you're taking all this trouble to go there, and you won't be able to see Shiva at all. And then he told me that with such conviction, she just kind of said, Baba, मैं तो बाबा केदारनाथ को नहीं देख सकूंगी, तो बाबा तो मुझे देखेंगे. That I won't be able to see Shiva in the altar, but Shiva will see me. But that's an amazing insight. Because see, when we go to a temple, we normally say, well, I'm going to have darshan. Like, I'm going to see the Lord. We don't always remember, the Lord is also going to see me. You see? And this awareness can be a great help and protection to a spiritual seeker. If I always remember that God is seeing me, that I'm never really alone, it can be a great strength. It can give us courage when we need it. It can stop us from doing some of the silly mistakes that we do in life. It will never make us feel that we are alone. It will never make us feel that we are unprotected. And that's true, it's not even an imagination. Because we say or keep saying that God is omnipresent, God is everywhere. If God is everywhere, then God is always seeing me. And so that's something very helpful to remember.
As a neuroscientist, we describe knowledge as being dependent on three processes: the acquisition of knowledge through discourses and reading, the retention of knowledge through practice, and finally the retrieval of knowledge. So if one cannot retrieve the knowledge that they have gained, that means they have not learned what knowledge is.
Yeah, that's true. Very true, very true. Okay. So, yes. Or abhang. Let's have one abhang before we close.